matters. Of course it does. Hi, I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. This program's been designed to educate, inform, and help you decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. It's information and resources that may help you manage to handle some law issues yourself. Or if you decide to work with professional counsel, our goal, of course, is for you to be prepared and for you to help when you work with your legal counsel. Our goal is for you to achieve the best possible results, save time, and save money. We once again welcome David Bazar, Attorney Bazar, with the Bazar and Associates law firm in East Providence, who continues to share his legal information and his insights and his anecdotes. So today, not surprisingly, we will be talking about COVID. That COVID-19 crisis facing the nation is virtually unprecedented, and the road forward is very uncertain. So as the country turns its attention to reopening businesses and getting employees back and serving customers and all of that, there are many debates about liability, about tort laws coming back and resurfacing in a big way, lots of risks to be shared. So there's new exposure to talk about. So legislators are pushing to protect businesses from liability, understandably, and then plaintiffs' lawyers are trying to bring in lawsuits for the personal injuries and deaths and so on and so forth. So we're wondering right now whether or not this is going to look like the biggest trial lawyer bonanza in any recent history. And there's a massive tangle of federal and state laws that could easily put all of those heroic frontline workers back in the years of endless lawsuits. So what are the legal considerations that determine whether to and how to construct protections for businesses? Should they have safe harbors? We have that to talk about. We have also the issue about contract breaches, which certainly have taken place. We also have a plethora, as they say, of executive orders, which may or may not be constitutional. So let's get started, but on a personal basis, let's start with the fact that one among us, David, has had COVID. So do tell. We're sorry to hear that you had it. You don't look worse for the wear, thankfully.
No,
but
I'm doing
what was
fine.
that like for you?
Well, I noticed we're more than 6 feet apart.
We are.
Yes.
Our producer planned it.
So I got exposed to the virus and ended up testing positive for it. And I went home. I was upset, of course, but I felt not well, but not that bad. And I was weak and tired and fever and cough, but I thought I was doing okay. In fact, I wrote a message as president of the Rhode Island Bar Association to the bar that I was lucky. And I said I was lucky because I had my wife at home to take care of me, who, by the way, was tested positive but was asymptomatic the whole time.
Was she? Oh.
So if you're going to get the antibodies, that's probably the best way to do it until there's a vaccine. But she was really lucky. But I had her, I had people at my office to take care of my office. I had the people at the bar doing a great job there. And I was just lucky. So right after I wrote that message to the bar, I wasn't so lucky. I guess I was getting a little sicker and sicker, and my wife ended up taking me to the Miriam Hospital. And so that was an interesting experience because she can't go in. So they know we were coming. We had called a doctor who would let them know. When we got there, they came out and put me in a wheelchair and took me in. I waved goodbye to my wife because she couldn't come in to see me. And they did a chest x-ray, and I had pneumonia, I guess, in both lungs, and that was the biggest issue. So I went on some oxygen, and they sent me upstairs, and I still didn't feel that bad, but the second night, apparently, I got worse, and they sent me down to the CCU. And I had high-flow oxygen and these machines in the room, and I don't remember opening my eyes and looking at the doctor, but a doctor came in and said, "I'm the doctor from the ICU. This is a medical student. We may have to put you on a ventilator."
Oh,
and
boy.
I said, "I'm not doing that." And he said, "Well, what do you mean you're not doing that?" I said, "I'm not doing that." In fact, I had just, before I got sick the day or two before, had a conversation with a judge in Rhode Island about the whole thing that was going on. And she had said, "David, do you know that 85% of the people who go on ventilators never get off?" And I just had that conversation running through my mind when this doctor came in. So he said, "Well, what if it's the only thing that'll save your life?" And I said, if we get to that point, come back and see me. But I'm having this conversation with you. I'm not at that point, so I'm not doing it. So after he left the room, the nurse asked me if I could roll over onto my stomach. And I could. So I said, yes, of course. So I rolled over. And after a little bit of time, the numbers started coming up. And I guess they call that pronation or something like that. Your lungs on the back get freed up a little bit. And so I was breathing better. And then the next day, they said I qualified to get remdesivir. And 4 days after that, I was discharged from the hospital. Went home, still very weak, but symptom-free actually at that point. No cough, no fever, a little bit of a cough. But very weak. And I started walking and getting my strength back, and 3 weeks later, I was back to work.
It's a good outcome, but certainly sounds like you had a little bit of an ordeal, to say the least.
It was a journey. But the doctors were great. There were 3 or 4 doctors a day who would come in and check on me and talk to me. And the nurses were unbelievable, and the CNAs and everybody else involved. It was just the best care you could ever have.
That's good. We're glad to hear those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
Certainly there are others, but we're glad that yours were good and with a good outcome. So the easy issue, I suppose, to talk about, there's only, as I understand it, only a handful of lawsuits regarding COVID-19 when the companies were claiming that people knew about coronavirus, but they didn't do enough to prevent its spread. Like a case in point, I guess, is the Princess Cruise. They knew of it in February. They didn't share enough information quickly enough, and we had troubles. So what goes on, if you use that as an example, how do you see litigation going forward when some people have this kind of case or worse, where they didn't let people know quickly enough, didn't respond quickly enough?
I think the litigation that may or may not develop as a result of different scenarios with the virus are going to be difficult. And I don't think there'll be a lot of them, and I don't think a lot of them will be successful unless you can prove that the defendant, whoever that might be, didn't act reasonably. And in this instance, with what we call the novel virus, because it's new and nobody knows a lot about it, not how to treat it, what works, what doesn't work, whereas remdesivir or hydroxychloroquine, whatever it is. So from a medical standpoint, if the doctors, all the doctors are still trying to figure it out, you can't hold a hospital or a doctor or a nurse or somebody negligent or breaching the standard of care for doing something that nobody knows exactly how to do it. And the same thing would apply to other businesses or other people as we're trying to figure this all out.
So I know when we've talked about personal injury cases and medical malpractice and the likes, you often refer to whatever the standard of care. Well, how do you have a standard care if it's unprecedented? So now does that mean you get a wider range of normal? And that might mean that you'd have fewer personal injury cases, but might you still have workers' compensation cases?
Yeah,
and you don't really need a cause then, or how would that go?
Workers' comp's different.
Yes.
So different states have handled this differently. Many states have said that if you got sick and you can show that it was from work, you can get workers' comp. And that's important because early on, when people were still going into work and they were exposed to someone else at work who had it, it developed at work. Now, a lot of times a disease or an illness or something like that isn't considered compensable under workers' comp, but many states' courts have decided that no, in this instance, given what's going on, they are going to let people collect workers' comp for that. But to go back to the negligence cases, if you have a case where clearly somebody did something that breached the standard of care, or what a reasonable person would do in a direct negligence case, then that could become a case. And of course, as things develop, the states are issuing guidelines as to how you're going to reopen and what you're going to do, and you don't follow those guidelines in your retail store or your restaurant or whatever, then perhaps if those are the standards that are set up and they're reasonable and you could have followed them and you chose not to, there could be a potential negligence claim. But that's all sort of remains to be seen.
How, if you were to defend a business, what would you say when the person who became ill said, I got it at work?
Yep.
How do you actually get to prove that when so many people know that they end up with COVID and they have no idea how they became subjected to it, exposed to it? And certainly not everyone has contact tracing.
Right.
And will that ever be a mandatory constitutional, legally, executive order issue, ever? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, so that's why some states have not adopted that. If you can show it came from work, we're automatically going to say it's work-related and workers' comp. But what strikes me is those meat packing factories where everybody, not everybody, but many, many people have it from work. It's probably pretty clear that if you're not the first one who got it, that you probably got it from work, and it's probably easier to prove. But it is true that it's not always easy to say where you got it from. But if you work with other people who got it and you were in contact with them and working closely, especially early on in this whole thing,
yes,
before we had the stay-at-home orders and these other things, it's probably more likely than not legally, causally related to that work environment, that most courts who are agreeing that it's a disease that would be covered from work would cover you as as being injured at work, so to speak.
And so now, many are signing on with that app that lets you contact trace. If someone has that, and now they're back to work, even though the place has implemented as many standards as they certainly can, whether it's masks, plexiglass, seating arrangements, cubicles gone, and the rest. If it now has, you have the ability to prove that it was contract traceable right to that spot of work, now will you have a workers' comp case, and what difference will it make anyway?
Yeah, so potentially, and again, it depends how the court interprets the injury versus the illness and that type of thing. But yeah, absolutely, if you can show you got it at work and the courts are interpreting the illness to be an injury, then you'll receive workers' comp.
What happens now with these heroic frontline workers and the rest? Now they have, there's an issue about some of the employees or some of the residents of homes, nursing homes, group homes and facilities saying, I want to sue that establishment. Is there safe harbor? Is there any protection? What's the latest with that? Even that ends up being an issue with executive orders in some cases. It's also a political hot potato.
Every governor who issues an executive order is issuing those executive orders based on the state's law on emergency procedures that authorities granted to the governor to issue executive orders to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens.
Yes.
And every state's emergency powers is different. So not every state has authorized their governor to issue laws in certain areas or executive orders. In law, that's usually done by the legislature. In Rhode Island, the governor has interpreted it that the Emergency Power Act that she has to act under doesn't allow her to change the law. In fact, I worked with her through the Bar Association to help with, and the Secretary of State in Rhode Island was very helpful in getting remote notarization by executive order, or actually through the Secretary of State in working with the governor to do that. I also tried to get the governor to allow us to have wills. In Rhode Island, a will has to be witnessed by two people in the presence, so the testator, the person creating the will, signs the will in the presence of two witnesses. I wanted the governor to issue an executive order that said video presence counts as presence for the execution of the will, because we had the stay-at-home orders. People were very nervous about their estates being in place, and wills that they were comfortable with being in place. So we couldn't have them come in, or really, it wasn't really possible to witness them in their presence, so could we do it by video presence? And the governor's legal counsel, and probably correctly so, felt that her powers didn't extend to changing the law and interpreting the law and allowing her to issue an executive order on that front. So certainly if she couldn't do that, I don't think she would have the authority to issue an order to give safe harbor to hospitals or nursing homes or anybody else, because that's a common law negligence claim that the courts would have authority over deciding. And if somebody wanted to bring a claim because they claim the nursing home didn't reach the standard of care and how they dealt with this, it's up to the court to decide. And given, like I said at the beginning, the novel nature of what we were dealing with, it's probable that it would be difficult to bring that case anyway successfully. But I think it's up to the courts to decide that, especially in light of the interpretation of the statute, at least in Rhode Island, that the governor can't change law. She can issue executive orders that protects people's health, safety, and welfare. And she's done a great job of doing that, and that's where her authority apparently ends.
What about, say you had not had a medical care directive when you went into the hospital, you know that your wife was bidding you adieu, couldn't go in. Suppose you didn't have the ability to make decisions. You would assume that your wife was the next in line to make that decision. But what about others who don't have that capability and can't even have someone on site to make a decision and sign the papers in front of the doctors or the social workers? What happens in that case? Is that Zoom video conferencing ability? Is that okay? Is that legal?
Well, for the doctors,
yes,
to be able to talk to someone, certainly that's not a problem.
And sign?
Well, that's different.
Yes.
The person who has to sign it, though, the story as you're describing it, isn't really in a place to be able to sign
right.
that. However, if the person has already put that authority in place, there's already a healthcare power of attorney or a healthcare proxy in Massachusetts, whatever it is, then I think it's absolutely appropriate and satisfactory for the doctor to talk to the person who has that authority already in place, to speak to them to get directive as to what should be done.
Do they have to record the conversation if they didn't have the ability to send in an email with a PDF that someone could sign and then scan back? I mean, all of these technical hoops, many people don't even have that capability, so how do you...
Well, what I'm saying is that I don't think you can execute a new document when you're not able to even give direction to the doctor.
Sounds right.
I'm saying
okay.
If you have a document, the person who has the authority under the document to act as your agent can tell the doctor what to do. I don't think it has to be recorded, because if you were able to be in the hospital, you could tell the doctor and it wouldn't be recorded.
Sounds right. About other contracts that businesses want to observe, if their businesses have been closed down, the word breach everywhere comes to mind. Pick one. You didn't pay your lease on time, whatever.
Yeah.
What are you supposed to do when you're not in business? Are these going to constitute ongoing lawsuits that are going to tie courts up, make lawyers lots of... What's going to happen with that, David?
Not paying your lease or your rent obviously can result in an eviction. And I know in Rhode Island, the governor's office has been exploring putting together a program with the district court in Rhode Island, which is in charge of residential and, in the first instance, commercial evictions, and trying to put together a program where we might bring in mediators to help resolve those issues, which I think is a good idea. Because there are going to be a lot of people who have been out of work who are going to be behind, but is the landlord best off just throwing them out, or is there a possibility of saying, well, here's what your rent is, you're back to work, let's pay a little extra towards the arrearage and enter an order that says as long as you do that, you're not getting evicted? There's lots of ways to resolve those kinds of issues, but those will be issues.
So maybe someone could have called and asked for a waiver or some leniency to be granted so that it never got to you're in breach of contract and we're going to have a situation.
Yeah, you would hope that two reasonable people could talk and work things out. That's not always how these things play out. But I understand with mortgages that banks have been working with people to give some delay in having to pay for like 3 or 4 months and catching up afterwards, that type of thing. So there are things like that that are out there. And the Rhode Island Superior Court actually, in its receivership, in the business calendar program, put together a whole new set of rules and processes for businesses that don't want to go out of business but have run into difficulty. And it used to be if you filed a receivership, which was like a bankruptcy, the business would be liquidated and closed. And so they put together a program to have non-liquidating receiverships so that businesses can work their way out of the difficulties that they became entangled in as a result of the whole pandemic.
Would that continue, or does it only apply to this particular situation?
No, I think the program they put together will continue, and I think it's actually helpful on a number of levels.
It does sound very good. So other breaches of contract, suppose you were supposed to meet with your partner and you have papers to sign and things that you need to enact together. You can't sign contracts together, you couldn't be together. What happens in those cases now?
Well,
it's not the doctor.
No. So if a contract, most contracts don't have to be signed in the presence of each other.
Okay.
So they should still be able to do business, transact business, and get things done. So with remote notarization, especially, if the contract needs to be notarized, not all of them do, some can just be witnessed, there should be ways to conduct business and get those things done. So that should be able to happen.
What's going on with the various courts, both the past few months, now, and in the next short term?
Yeah,
as you know it?
In the past few months, they've been pretty much closed, open for emergency hearings.
Such as?
Abuse complaints, domestic abuse, some criminal cases and arraignments, maybe remotely on some instances if they can be, or some of the criminal hearings. Juvenile cases, DCYF cases, emergencies, temporary restraining orders, emergencies that the court would normally hear either on an ex parte or an expedited hearing basis. They've been opened for some of those emergency type cases. Now they've opened for more widespread cases, and even all through this, they were starting to use WebEx and Zoom in some instances, or whatever platform they use to hold court remotely, and that continues. I believe the 2 outlying courthouses in Rhode Island, Washington County, and I think Newport County are closed. Some of those hearings are being held by WebEx or other remote hearing ability platforms. In some cases are being heard in some of the other open courthouses.
Have those been well received, or are there times that you have heard, or do you expect to hear, that someone is feeling that they don't have justice carried when, I don't know, maybe they can't face the accuser, they can't have the same interaction with a witness, an expert witness, or whatever, all of those intricacies that go on within the confines of that court setting.
Yeah.
Has that become an issue at all?
Not yet, but I'm not technologically savvy. But the way it seems to work is if you're having a hearing in court, the judges are holding those hearings, even it's not in court, it's WebEx, say, as if it were in court. And so the judge opens up the case just like the judge would do in court, telling the stenographer who is on the video taking everything down stenographically, this is the case of such and such, this is the case number, and this is parties identify themselves for the record, and the parties are on the call or the platform, the video platform, the attorneys are on the video platform, and it's live streamed to the judiciary website, so anyone in the public who wants to watch it, like the old court watchers would do going into court, they can click on to see what's going on, because these hearings are public hearings unless they're juvenile or closed for some other reason. And so it's as if you were there, but you're doing it by video.
Interesting. And of course, for some of us who've watched television, there have been recent television episodes with judges in courtrooms who've had to take the initiative by showing that they were holding court via Zoom or
Yep.
some other video conferencing capability. So on the personal level, we've had some of our rights taken away from us recently. Is it legal for our governor to say you can't go over our state line? So we may be sitting in Seekonk, Massachusetts, which is right across 3 minutes from East Providence, Rhode Island, and a governor can say you cannot go to the next state unless you're going for work. If you do, you have to quarantine for 14 days. Apparently, you can't get the virus by going to work. You can only get it if you go to shop across the state line. Some of those things don't make a lot of sense. Do they hold water? Are they constitutionally okay? What's the issue?
I never actually interpreted it that way. So if you lived in East Providence and you wanted to go to Seekonk to go to that grocery store, I think you could do that. And you already had a stay-at-home order, so you weren't really going anywhere anyway. So I don't believe that when you say quarantine for 14 days, that it applied the same way it would apply as if you lived in New York or Connecticut or Massachusetts and were moving in with someone in Rhode Island, in which case you're coming from another state and would have to quarantine for the 14 days as the governor had ordered because you didn't live in Rhode Island. I believe if you lived in Rhode Island and you went out of state temporarily to buy bread or paper towels if you could find them, or toilet paper, that you would still live your life the way you lived your life, which was stay at home anyway.
So if you lived in one state but you happened to be vacationing in Florida and wanted to get home, you flew, maybe one of 4 on a plane at the time, you're in quarantine.
Yes.
Legitimate?
Yes, I think it is legitimate because it protects the public safety and the health and welfare of all the other citizens. And it's the right thing to do, at least at that time when we were in the middle of the whole pandemic.
Are there other specific things that you've been hearing, calls that you've received, perhaps relative to COVID, that you might not have imagined, or maybe you have imagined, that are going to become cases soon?
Well, not yet, but talk about being in quarantine or confined to your home, stay at home. I can imagine that there's going to be people who are very happy with the situation who they're quarantined with, and some who aren't quite as happy. But yes, I think there's going to be a lot of different things that come out of the whole pandemic and what everyone's been through. And I think the governors of Rhode Island and Massachusetts have done a really good job of dealing with this. And I think they've also done a good job of putting us back to work and reopening, as they say, in a smart and safe way.
Reasonable way.
Yeah.
Let's hope so. So let's hope that there aren't as many divorces as they might imagine, murders perhaps, and bankruptcy, but certainly it looks like things are getting back on track as a result of COVID.
Or maybe more babies.
Or more babies too. Both sides of it. We thank you for tuning in to The Law Matters. We hope you will continue to do so because, as we say, the law matters to you.